Right now, somewhere, a woman is thinking about a man who stopped chasing her, and he has no idea. She is not thinking about him the way she used to, and she is not thinking about him the way he assumes. Something has shifted in her mind, quietly, without her even choosing it. And most men never see this moment because it happens far away from them, in a silence they created without understanding what that silence actually does. You have probably lived this without realizing it. A woman pulls back, or you pull back, and you assume the story ends there. That distance simply fades into nothing. But distance is never nothing, not to her. There is a very specific sequence that unfolds in a woman's mind once the chasing stops. Most men never learn it because it doesn't happen out loud. It happens in private thoughts, in replayed moments, in a kind of internal reckoning she may never admit to anyone. Today, I am going to walk you through exactly what that sequence looks like, step by step, moment by moment, so you finally understand what she is thinking when you stop chasing her. The first thing she feels isn't peace. It's a small, nagging interruption, like a sound that stopped and she can't say when. She doesn't announce this to herself. There's no dramatic realization, no single moment she points to, just an absence where there used to be presence. And absences are strange things. They don't feel like nothing. Think back to a conversation that once seemed ordinary, one where a message came in at a predictable hour or a certain kind of attention arrived without you asking for it. It becomes part of the emotional furniture of her day, so familiar that she stops noticing it consciously. Then one day, it isn't there. That gap doesn't disappear quietly. It sits in the background of her attention, the way a picture frame left crooked on a wall pulls the eye even when you're looking at something else. She isn't obsessing. She isn't panicking. She's simply aware in a low, persistent way that something in her environment has changed. Of course, context always matters here. If the man in question was barely present to begin with, this interruption barely registers. But if there was any real rhythm to the attention, any pattern she had come to expect, the break in that pattern becomes surprisingly loud. That is the moment most men walk away from without realizing it. They assume silence is neutral. It rarely is. But that interruption alone doesn't explain why she starts checking. For that, we have to look at what her mind assumes about silence. Here's something most men never learn about how women process disappearance. Silence isn't read as absence, it's read as information. Behavioral researchers have observed that human beings are wired with something called a negativity bias, the tendency to give more psychological weight to uncertain or negative changes than to positive or neutral ones. In plain terms, when something familiar disappears without explanation, the brain treats the gap as a puzzle that needs solving, not a fact that can be ignored. This isn't a female trait exclusively, but it plays out in a very particular way in the early stages of romantic interest. When a woman is used to being pursued and that pursuit stops, her mind doesn't default to "he lost interest," simple as that. It defaults to searching for a reason. Now, you might be thinking, couldn't this just be indifference on her part? Sometimes yes. If she genuinely never cared, the silence changes nothing for her. But if there was real engagement, even subtle engagement, the withdrawal activates something closer to an itch than a shrug. Her mind starts running quiet background questions. Did something happen? Did she misread something? Did the interest that seemed present actually exist at all? This is not overthinking in the dramatic sense people imagine. It's smaller than that, quieter, more automatic. And what she does with that information isn't dramatic either. It's quiet, almost involuntary, and it starts with a single question she asks herself. It doesn't start with, "Why did he stop texting?" It starts with something closer to home. The first real question that surfaces, more often than not, sounds something like this. What does this say about me? Not about him, about her. This detail surprises most men because they assume they're the subject of her thoughts. In some ways they are, but the entry point is almost always self-referential first. Did I do something? Did I seem too available? Did I misjudge how interested I actually was? This reframing matters enormously because once her attention turns inward, it stops being about him as an external event and starts becoming about her own self-perception. And self-perception is far stickier than curiosity about another person. One instance of this internal questioning means very little on its own. People have passing thoughts about almost everything, but when the questioning repeats, when it resurfaces more than once over a period of days, it stops being a passing thought and starts becoming a pattern of attention. The common mistake men make here is assuming that if she's not reaching out, she's not thinking about it at all. Silence on her end is often mistaken for disinterest, when it may simply be processing. That question doesn't stay abstract for long. It starts attaching itself to specific memories of him. She's not thinking about you in general. She's thinking about one specific moment, and she didn't decide to. This is where things become genuinely interesting because human memory doesn't recall relationships as a blur. It recalls specific sensory fragments, a tone of voice, a particular comment, the way someone stood when they said goodbye. Psychologists call this involuntary autobiographical memory, recollection that surfaces without deliberate effort, usually triggered by an emotional cue. In practice, this means she isn't reviewing a general impression of you. She's replaying a single exchange, maybe something you said in passing that carried more confidence than you realized at the time, or a moment where you didn't chase her attention and she noticed the restraint. Here's the detail that separates a forgettable interaction from a replayed one: specificity. Vague, generic exchanges rarely get revisited. But a moment with texture, an unexpected joke, a calm response to something that usually gets an anxious reaction. Those moments get filed differently in memory, and they resurface uninvited. This does not mean every replayed memory signals romantic significance. Sometimes a memory resurfaces simply because it was unusual, not because it was meaningful, but when it recurs alongside the self-questioning from before, the pattern becomes very clear. Before we move to the next layer, there is one additional detail most explanations skip over entirely. The specific memories that resurface are almost always the ones where you were least trying to impress her. Confidence without performance is what gets replayed. Effort rarely is. Once that memory resurfaces, it doesn't stay isolated. She starts comparing it to something else entirely. This is the part she'd never say out loud, not even to her closest friend. Once a specific memory of you becomes active in her mind, it doesn't sit there alone for long. It starts to function as a reference point, and reference points invite comparison. Specifically, she begins comparing the way you made her feel against how other men currently available to her make her feel. This is not necessarily a conscious ranking system. It's closer to an emotional baseline shifting without her explicit permission. If the men currently pursuing her are eager, constant, easy to predict, and you are not, the contrast itself becomes information. Scarcity recalibrates perceived value. This is a well-documented psychological pattern. When something becomes less available, the mind unconsciously assigns it more significance, independent of whether that significance is rationally justified. Remember what I told you at the start, that something is happening in her mind right now that most men can't see. This is close to the center of it. The comparison rarely favors constant availability. Ironically, the men who are still actively chasing her often become less distinct in her mind, not more, because their behavior offers no contrast, nothing to measure against. You, by stepping back, accidentally became the variable that stands out. Of course, this doesn't mean withdrawal alone creates attraction. If there was no genuine connection to begin with, contrast has nothing to work with. But when real rapport existed, absence becomes a kind of quiet spotlight. The common mistake here is assuming her attention toward available men means you've been forgotten. Often, it means the opposite. You've become the exception she's measuring everyone else against. And this recalibration leads somewhere most men never expect, not toward chasing you back, but toward something quieter and more permanent. Here's the part almost nobody talks about. This shift, once it happens, is hard to undo. What occurs at this stage is not simply renewed interest. It's something psychologists sometimes describe as recategorization, the mental process of moving someone from one internal category to another. Before, you may have existed in her mind as an option, one of several. After this sequence plays out, you often shift into a different, smaller category, someone worth genuine consideration. This matters because recategorization tends to be sticky. Once someone is filed as significant rather than incidental, that filing doesn't easily reverse itself, even if circumstances change again later. It's part of why some connections linger in memory long after they've technically ended, and why others fade the moment contact resumes. This is not a guarantee of anything. Recategorization doesn't promise a relationship, a reply, or a reconciliation. What it does is change the emotional weight you carry in her mind going forward, quietly, permanently, without her ever needing to say it to you. The men who chase relentlessly rarely trigger this shift because there's no gap for comparison to work inside. The men who disappear resentfully rarely trigger it either because bitterness closes the loop instead of leaving it open. It's the calm, intentional stepping back, without anger, without pursuit, that creates the conditions for this quiet internal shift to occur. So the question we opened with finally has its answer. What she thinks in that silence is rarely indifference. It's a private, involuntary process of noticing, questioning, remembering, comparing, and ultimately refiling you somewhere new in her mind. You don't need to manufacture this. You don't need to overanalyze every silence as strategy. What you need is simply to understand that stepping back is never actually neutral. And once you understand that, you stop needing her behavior to reassure you of your own value. That is the real shift, not something you do to her, something that happens in you once you stop needing the chase to feel worthy of attention. If this resonated with you, I want to hear it directly. Has this ever happened to you? Did she come back around after you pulled away? Tell me what she said or did in the comments. I read every single one, and some of the most honest insight on this channel comes from what you share there. On this channel, we look closely at the psychology most people never explain clearly. Not tricks, not games, just the real mechanics of how attraction actually works. In the next video, I'll show you the exact moment, not the day, the exact moment a woman decides a man is no longer safe to ignore.